Hello and welcome to Baiju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by Krishnan Srinivasan, a former Foreign Secretary of India, and he evaluates the ongoing geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe, which has been further aggravated by the latest refugee crisis that has erupted along the Poland Belarus border. See, this topic might appear to be not connected to our UPSC syllabus and to Indian foreign policy interests. But a careful observation will tell you that India has very important foreign policy objectives and interests in Eastern Europe, and also the refugee migration crisis that the world is dealing with has an impact on Indian interests as well. Hence, the topic becomes important for our exams. So let's understand this in complete detail. See, a few weeks ago, a major refugee crisis emerged along the borders between Poland and Belarus. Thousands of asylum seekers from conflict hit Middle Eastern countries like Iraq and Syria, especially those belonging to the Kurd community, had entered Belarus in the hope of sneaking across the border into Poland so that they could enter the European Union and finally seek refuge in Germany. The Belarus Poland border constitutes the external border of the European Union, and you can clearly see in this map that the border crossings between Belarus and EU countries such as Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania represents the external borders of the European Union. Poland and European Union alleged that it was Belarus which was permitting the visa-free entry of refugees from West Asia and was encouraging them to cross over the EU border in order to exert pressure on the European Union. Poland, being a EU member, tried to push back against this illegal entry of refugees and migrants. And in these harsh conditions along the border, several refugees unfortunately died as well. So this crisis escalated tensions between Poland and Belarus, and as well as between Belarus and the European Union. And this issue also has much wider ramifications involving the European Union, Poland, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and as well as NATO. The writer is of the opinion that the current tensions in Eastern Europe, including the border crisis between Poland and Belarus, is a direct result of geopolitical rivalries between these players, and he refers to this refugee crisis as a manufactured refugee crisis. To understand this argument of the writer, you need to first understand the geopolitical motivations of all these players, and that would make it easier for us to understand this topic. First, let's talk about Belarus. See, Belarus is under a dictatorial president known as Alexander Lukashenko. He has won 6 back-to-back elections, most of which have been alleged as fraudulent elections by the Western countries and by the European Union. The European Union has also accused the government of Alexander Lukashenko to have committed gross human rights violations in the country, and on the grounds of violating democratic norms and constitutional principles, Belarus has been placed under sanctions by the European Union. So these economic sanctions of the EU on Belarus has brought the country under a lot of pressure. Then upon this, Belarus and its president have a very close political and economic relationship with Russia. See, for Russia, Belarus is a crucial geopolitical partner because it represents the last frontier against a creeping NATO which has been increasing its influence in Eastern Europe. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a Western military alliance led primarily by the United States and the United Kingdom, is closely aligned with the European Union in their strategies and objectives. And since a few years, they have been stepping up their influence across Eastern Europe in order to counter the Russian influence in the region. Because during the Cold War, most of these East European countries, like Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, etc., they were all part of the former Soviet Union. So Russia is traditionally very influential in these East European countries, and NATO and the EU, led by US, UK, and other countries, are trying to exert their influence to counter Russia's geopolitical interests in the region. But this doesn't mean Belarus is exactly an ally of Russia, because despite sharing close political and economic relations, Belarus had even threatened to block a key Russian oil pipeline that transports natural gas to the European Union. So, in this regard, Russia is dependent on Belarus because this key oil pipeline transports Russian natural gas into the EU. And Belarus was threatening to block this oil pipeline due to its own tensions with Russia. But however, Western governments led by US, UK, and the European Union, they believe that Belarus took up this hostile action across the Poland border at the instigation of Russia. It has even been alleged that Russia triggered this crisis deliberately because it is making imminent plans to invade Ukraine and possibly trying to annex Ukraine. But according to the writer, these Western allegations are not entirely true because if Russia is instigating a refugee crisis against European Union using Belarus, then it would threaten to derail Russia's close relations with Germany. See, despite the geopolitical divide between Russia and Western Europe, Russia has managed to build close relations with Germany, particularly in the energy sector. Russia happens to be a key supplier of natural gas to the European Union, and there are two important gas pipelines that pass through Belarus and through Ukraine. But since these pipelines pass through Belarus and Ukraine, which have issues with Russia, continuing this supply of natural gas to the EU has become problematic for Russia. So Russia has worked with Germany to bypass these pipelines passing through Belarus and Ukraine, and instead they have built a parallel pipeline that passes through the Baltic Sea known as the Nord Stream pipelines. This is seen as a strategic project by both Russia and Germany, but it has been strongly opposed by the United States, which feels its influence to be declining in Western Europe as Russia becomes a key energy supplier to Western Europe and to Germany. So the writer points out that since many years, Western countries led by US and West European countries have been trying to meddle in Ukraine by trying to extend the influence of European Union and NATO. Earlier attempts were made to include Ukraine as a EU member, and NATO has also increased its military presence in and around Ukraine and as well as in and around Russia. It was this aggressive policy of the West which pushed Russia to meddle in Ukraine in 2014 and pushed the country and the region into a major crisis. As a result of this standoff between the West and Russia, Russia went ahead to annex Crimea or the Crimean Peninsula, and gradually since 2014, the Crimea region has been integrated as a part of Russian territory. This annexation of Crimea by Russia was seen as illegal and hostile by the Western countries, and they not only boycotted Russia from various platforms, including the G8, but they also placed Russia under economic sanctions. Then, as the geopolitical rivalry between Russia and the US played out in Ukraine, Russia is alleged to have sponsored a civil war in Ukraine, where pro Russian separatists challenged to capture power in the country from the pro US Ukrainian government. This pushed the country into a civil war, and even today, Ukraine is deeply divided, where you have breakaway provinces in the Donbas region. These breakaway provinces, known as Donetsk and Luhansk, have been largely aligned with Russia, and the separatists operating over here receive direct support from Russian intelligence agencies. Whereas the Ukrainian government, which is largely pro West, retains only limited control in few parts of Ukraine. To resolve this crisis in Ukraine, in 2015, the Minsk Agreement had been worked out, involving Russia, the Ukrainian government, and the separatist groups. And these breakaway provinces in the Donbas region have been given limited autonomy, including the provision of holding provincial elections with decentralization and greater autonomy in the socio-economic domain. But this relative autonomy enjoyed in the breakaway Ukrainian provinces has been alleged by Western governments in the European Union that Russia is going to slowly annex these autonomous areas as well, just like it annexed Crimea in 2014. So, as the border crisis erupted along the Poland Belarus border, Western politicians and Western governments alleged that Russia is making preparations to invade Ukraine and to possibly annex few parts of Ukraine, which are the breakaway provinces. So, on these lines, it was alleged that Belarus was acting at the behest of Russia and was deliberately inviting refugees from conflict hit countries in West Asia, and it was accommodating them along the EU border so that they could sneak across into Poland in order to enter EU territory and later seek refuge in Germany. While Russia is known to use governments like Belarus and separatists in Ukraine to counter the rising Western influence, it defies logic, according to the writer, as to why Russia would risk affecting its ties with Germany, because then that would end up derailing the strategic Nord Stream 2 project as well. So he believes that Western countries led by US are merging the border crisis, which has been triggered by Belarus, with the Ukrainian issue in an attempt to possibly derail the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany, which they have been opposing for many years. On the other hand, the president of Belarus may not just be acting at the behest of Russia, but he would also be seeking to extract concessions from the European Union in order to get these sanctions lifted. Because there exists a similar precedent in the 2015 refugee crisis that was faced by the EU. Back then, EU countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, Greece, and the others were receiving a huge inflow of refugees from North African countries and West Asian countries, which were affected by conflict and poverty. As the refugee crisis started burdening the EU countries, the EU started offering financial incentives to countries like Libya and Turkey, which were being used as a transit point by the refugees. The EU offered these incentives to these countries so that they themselves could act against the flow of refugees and prevent them from entering the European Union. So, this precedent, established in 2015 by the EU, might have motivated the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, to trigger this crisis and exert pressure on the EU so that in return he could seek a lifting of the economic sanctions. Then, even Poland, on the other hand, has tried to exploit the crisis for its own geopolitical benefit, as Poland, being a member of the EU, faces several issues with the West European countries. While the West European countries are more liberal and progressive, Poland is known for its conservative right wing principles. Recently, Poland has brought out several laws and policies which are very conservative and regressive, and in the name of protecting traditional conservative values, it targets homosexuals and the LGBTQ community, and has also brought out laws against abortion and has even banned several journalists and NGOs. These laws and policies of Poland go against the liberal progressive policies of the European Union. This places Poland in violation of the EU treaty and principles. But recently, a constitutional tribunal of Poland has invalidated some of these provisions of the European Union treaty in order to promote the conservative laws and policies of Poland. So, this had led to a political crisis between the EU and Poland, and now Poland is trying to use this opportunity to project itself as the defender of EU's borders against the large scale influx of refugees into the region. So, in short, what this depicts is that the refugee crisis seen along the Poland Belarus border is largely a manufactured crisis by Belarus, and it is an outcome of intense geopolitical rivalry between the regional players and global players. The ongoing issue reflects the geopolitical tensions involving Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, European Union, NATO, and the United States. Now, these tensions and the ongoing destabilization across Belarus and Ukraine has deep ramifications for Indian interests because India does actively engage with Eastern Europe, and any instability in the region affects India's interests deeply. Then, upon this refugee crisis also highlights the failure of the global community to work out a lasting solution to deal with refugees and migrants. Because such refugee and humanitarian situations are not just limited to the European Union, but it also affects the United States, India, and many other countries. Asylum seekers from poor countries and conflict hit countries try to enter stable countries like India, US, and the European Union region in order to protect their lives and to secure a livelihood for themselves. Just like India receives the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, the US is known to receive refugees from several conflict zones and poor countries, and the EU in particular is facing a humanitarian crisis as it receives a huge inflow of asylum seekers from North Africa and West Asia. Despite these challenges faced by these countries, and despite the grave humanitarian crisis that we are staring at, there is still no global solution to deal with refugees and migrants. One has to remember that a refugee crisis of this scale can easily lead to wars between two countries, as witnessed during the 1971 war between India and Pakistan. Plus, on humanitarian grounds, there is a need to protect the human rights of refugees and asylum seekers because many of these countries which receive refugees, they are very selective in accepting the refugees. And hence the writer argues that there is a need for a global treaty or a convention that will lay down the basic standards as to how countries should be treating refugees and migrants. The only progress made in this regard is the Global Compact on Migration, which was brought out by the United Nations in 2018. But this global compact has not been accepted by most countries, including India, and hence there is an urgent need to bring out a comprehensive international law that mandates how countries should deal with refugees and migrants. In this regard, India in particular has to lead from the front because India has a rich history of accepting refugees on humanitarian grounds. In the past, India has taken in Tibetan refugees, Afghan refugees, Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka, and of course the Bengali refugees from East Pakistan. But its selective rejection of the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar has put a question mark on India's track record with regard to protecting and upholding the human rights of refugees. So countries like India and other European countries will have to work together to work out a global treaty or a convention to lay down an international law to deal with refugees and migrants. The reason why a new convention is needed is because the 1951 Refugee Convention is outdated and doesn't suit the current context. This convention was drafted in the context of the World War and was specifically applicable to the European region. Later, to the 1967 Additional Protocol, the Refugee Convention of 1951 was expanded in its mandate. But despite this, many countries like India haven't joined the Refugee Convention or the Additional Protocol to it, as they find several provisions to be objectionable. So that is why a new convention is needed to deal with refugees and migrants, and countries like India, US, and West European countries have to lead from the front. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which deals with the disruption of parliamentary proceedings as a parliamentary tactic. See, recently the government introduced a few bills to repeal the controversial farm laws, and when these bills were introduced, the opposition wanted to have a debate in order to hold the government accountable for first enacting the controversial farm laws. But the government tried to rush through these bills, which sought the repeal of the controversial farm laws and denied an opportunity for the opposition to have a debate on the issue. This refusal of the government to allow parliamentary debate to take place on the floor of the House led few opposition members to behave in an unruly, unparliamentary manner, which ended up disrupting parliamentary proceedings. And this led Rajya Sabha Chairman and Vice President M. Venkaiah Naidu to suspend 12 opposition members. So, in this context, the editorial takes a look at the disruption of parliamentary proceedings as a parliamentary tactic and points out that both disruption of proceedings and the suspension of MPs, they both equally undermine democracy and parliamentary accountability. See, when it comes to disruption of parliamentary proceedings as a parliamentary tactic to be used by opposition MPs, there are two conflicting arguments that exist. One side argues that frequent and violent disruption of parliamentary proceedings ends up bringing disrespect to the parliament and also derails parliamentary efficiency as the House gets stuck in a logjam and prevents meaningful debates and proceedings from taking place. This section argues that unruly behavior by opposition MPs affects the ability of the parliament to debate on key issues and bills, and since it reduces parliamentary efficiency, they call for very strict action to be taken against those opposition MPs who disrupt parliamentary proceedings. Parliamentary procedures allows the Speaker and the Chairman to take several measures against unruly members of the House, including their suspension from the House. But there are others who argue that disrupting parliamentary proceeding as a parliamentary tactic is a legitimate parliamentary instrument. This argument was made by former Union Minister Arun Jaitley himself. So the current government has accused the opposition of frequently disrupting parliamentary proceedings and has hence tried to take strict action against opposition members, and it has tried to rush through bills denying any opportunity for debate, thereby denying an opportunity for parliamentary scrutiny of executive action. Ironically, today's ruling party, when it was in the opposition between 2004 and 2014, had resorted to similar tactics of parliamentary disruption to derail parliamentary proceedings during the previous UPA governments. During these frequent disruptions that were caused by the BJP back then opposition leader Arun Jaitley had remarked that disrupting parliamentary proceeding as a parliamentary tactic is a legitimate parliamentary tool and instrument that is available to the opposition to hold the government accountable. But now, the same party which is in power seems to be taking very strict action against opposition members who are resorting to similar tactics by claiming that it is derailing the efficiency of the parliament, and in the process, it has been trying to rush through bills and prevent parliamentary debates on the floor of the House. See, in a parliamentary democracy, the accepted norm is that during parliamentary proceedings, the majority, that is the government, the ruling party, will have its way, whereas the minority, that is the opposition, should at least get to have a say. It essentially means that a parliamentary democracy is a democracy of the majority. The ruling party, which has the majority in the House, will definitely get its way while passing bills, but the opposition, which is in minority, should at least be given an opportunity to have a say in these bills through the process of debates and parliamentary procedures. Because it is through this route that the opposition can hold the executive accountable for its actions. In fact, this is even enshrined under Article 75 of the Constitution, which mandates that the Council of Ministers shall be collectively responsible to the Parliament, that is, to the House of the People. This collective responsibility is ensured by allowing the opposition to question the executive and to scrutinize its actions by holding extensive debates on the floor of the House. So, this is where the editorial feels that a balance has to be struck between the government and the opposition. The editorial clearly remarks that unnecessary and prolonged disruption of the parliamentary proceeding undermines democracy, and even the government's refusal to allow debates and to take strict action against opposition members for disrupting proceedings equally undermines democracy. So while the opposition has a responsibility to display civility and to behave in a civil manner on the floor of the House, it definitely has the right to carry out disruption, but in a justified and meaningful manner in order to raise its voice against the majority. If these disruptions are brief and momentary, and when they are warranted, then parliamentary disruption can be definitely considered as a parliamentary tactic, which is a legitimate instrument available to the opposition. But in the first place, disruptions will arise from the opposition only when the government is not facilitating debate and scrutiny. So it's upon the government and the ruling party to facilitate the opposition to exercise their right to debate and scrutinize the actions of the government and to hold the executive accountable on the floor of the House. Next, on page number 7, we have a column written by IPS officer R.K. Vij, who is a senior police officer from the Chhattisgarh Police. In this column, he points out a grave error committed by the Allahabad High Court in its recent judgment in a case of sexual assault against a minor child under the provisions of the POCSO Act. POCSO stands for Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, and it aims to protect children from sexual offences and deliver strict punishment to the perpetrators. But unfortunately, this law has been misinterpreted and misread by the judiciary on several occasions. And in fact, we had taken up a similar debate on the 19th of November in our Hindu analysis. So I would request you to go and watch this video and then go through the column once. Now let's look at this important article from page number 9. According to the article, the Lok Sabha has passed the Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation Bill 2020. This bill seeks to regulate assisted reproductive technologies such as IVF or in vitro fertilization and as well as certain aspects of surrogacy. The provisions of this bill can be very important for both prelims and as well as for mains. But unfortunately, the article over here doesn't comprehensively cover the provisions of the bill. So let us use this opportunity to go into the details of the bill and to develop a comprehensive understanding of this important legislation. See, India has become the hub of global fertility industry and medical tourism. So in order to regulate India's fertility treatment industry, the Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation Bill 2020 was brought out by the government. See, this bill was first suggested by the Indian Council for Medical Research back in 2008. After several years of delay, the government finally brought out the bill and it was approved by the Union Cabinet last year. Following this, the bill was introduced in the Parliament and yesterday, the Lok Sabha has passed the bill. This bill seeks to lay down minimum standards and code of conduct for fertility clinics and as well as for egg and sperm banks in the country. The bill first defines what is assisted reproductive technology. It includes all techniques that seek to obtain a pregnancy by handling the sperm or the oocyte, which is the immature egg cell, outside of the human body and transferring the gamete which has been fertilized or the embryo into the reproductive system of a woman. So it covers all ART technologies and services, including IVF or in vitro fertilization, where the egg is fertilized in a lab, and also covers other ART related services, such as gamete donation, which is the donation of sperms or oocyte or the egg, which is used for fertilizing the egg to form the embryo, which is then transferred into the womb to provide for assisted reproduction. It also covers gestational surrogacy, where the child is not biologically related to the surrogate mother. That is, commissioning parents who can't have children of their own, they would have commissioned a surrogate mother to bear their child, and such surrogate pregnancies falls under the definition of gestational surrogacy. The bill states that ART services will be provided through ART fertility clinics, which offer ART related treatments and procedures. And the bill also regulates the functioning of ART banks, which store and supply the gametes, that is, the sperms and the eggs. So the provisions of the bill lays down minimum standards and code of conduct for these facilities, that is, ART clinics and fertility clinics, and for ART banks. In order to regulate these institutions, the bill provides for mandatory registration of these institutions under the National Registry of Banks and Clinics of India. This national registry will be established under the provisions of the bill, and it will act as a national database which will contain the details of all fertility clinics and ART banks in the country. The state governments will be made responsible for appointing the registration authorities in order to facilitate the registration process. And all the clinics and banks registered under the database, they will have to maintain the strict standards laid down by the bill. These facilities will be required to match the standards laid down by the government with regard to having adequate manpower, that is specialized technical manpower, along with the required physical infrastructure and diagnostic facilities. Such registration offered to these facilities will remain valid for a period of 5 years, and it can be later renewed for a period of another 5 years following a thorough review and inspection. The government does reserve the right to cancel the registration or suspend the registration during the time period itself if these facilities fail to maintain the minimum standards that have been prescribed under the law. Next, the bill also lays down the conditions for gamete donation and for supply of gametes. It mandates that the screening of gamete donors, collection of gametes, and its storage can only be done by registered and authorized ART banks. It also states that a gamete bank can obtain the semen from males who are between 21 to 55 years of age, and they can obtain the eggs or oocytes from women who are in between the age of 23 to 35 years. It also states that the egg donor or the oocyte donor should be an ever married woman having at least one alive child of her own who has attained a minimum age of at least 3 years. This provision ensures that the oocyte donor already has a child of her own and doesn't get attached to the child born out of her eggs through the help of assisted reproductive technologies. Also, the donor woman can donate oocytes only once in her life and not more than 7 oocytes can be retrieved from her. This is to ensure that vulnerable women are not exploited by the industry, and it aims to prevent the abuse of women through assisted reproductive technologies. The bill also mandates that a bank cannot supply gametes of a single donor to more than one commissioning couples. This provision has been included to prevent donors from exploiting these technologies for their commercial gain. These restrictions also help in addressing the ethical concerns surrounding assisted reproductive technology. The bill also lays down the conditions for offering ART services. According to the bill, ART procedures can be carried out by these registered institutions only after obtaining the written informed consent of both the parties who are seeking ART services and as well as that of the donor. That is, the institutions have been mandated to obtain written consent from the commissioning couple, from the commissioning parents, and as well as from the gamete donors. Then the party seeking the services, that is the commissioning parents, they are required to provide for insurance coverage in favor of the egg donor in order to guarantee the financial protection of women who is donating her egg and provide for any compensation in case of any loss, damage, or death. Then the fertility clinics are prohibited from offering to provide children of predetermined sex to the commissioning parents. This is to ensure that the commissioning couple cannot demand a male child, which has become a social norm in a patriarchal society that has directly contributed to female infanticide. So, to ensure gender parity, fertility clinics are prohibited from offering children of predetermined sex. The bill also requires the facilities to check for any existing genetic diseases amongst the donors who are donating the sperm and the egg before the embryo is implanted into the womb of the mother. The bill goes on to recognize the rights of a child born through assisted reproductive technology. According to the bill, a child born through ART will be deemed to be a biological child of the commissioning couple and will be entitled to all the rights and privileges that are available to the naturally born child of the commissioning couple. This ensures that a child born through ART is in no way discriminated by the commissioning parents and thus gets to enjoy all the rights and privileges. Then the bill also recognizes that the donor will not have any parental rights over the child who is born through ART technology. So donors who might have donated their sperms or eggs can no way claim legal rights or parental rights over the child, and this guarantees the rights of the commissioning parents. To establish and enforce these regulations, the bill provides for the establishment of national and state boards. According to the bill, the national and state boards for surrogacy, which are being established under the Surrogacy Regulation Bill 2019, will act as the national and state boards for regulation of ART services as well. So let's take a look at the powers and functions that will be carried out by the national and state boards. These boards will have the powers to advise the central government and the state governments respectively on ART related policy matters. The boards can review and monitor the implementation and enforcement of the bill. They also play a role in formulating the code of conduct and laying down the minimum standards for the fertility clinics and the ART banks, and they will also oversee various bodies that are going to be constituted under the bill. At the state level, the state boards will coordinate the enforcement of these policies and regulatory guidelines and will work in close coordination with the national board. Then finally, the bill defines offences related to ART and provides for strict penalties and punishments. Under the bill, the following offences have been included. It covers abandoning or exploiting the children born through ART, selling, purchasing, trading, or importing human embryos or gametes, using intermediates or middlemen for obtaining donors, exploiting the commissioning couple or women or the gamete donor in any form, transferring the human embryo into a male or into an animal. So, keeping in mind all the ethical and legal concerns related to ART, these offences have been clearly spelt out and they will attract very strict punishment and penalties. These offences will be punishable with a fine of up to 5 to 10 lakh rupees for the first violation, and for subsequent violations, these offences will be punishable with a jail term ranging between 8 to 12 years along with a hefty fine. If any fertility clinics or ART banks are advertising or offering sex selective ART, then it would be treated as an offence which will be punishable with imprisonment up to 5 to 10 years along with a hefty fine. Then the bill also mandates that no court will take notice of offences under the bill except on a complaint made by the national or state boards or an officer authorized by the board. This ensures that only the national and state boards can bring up legitimate and genuine cases to the courts and prevents any legal controversies from emerging later between the commissioning parents and the donors. So, as per the bill, the commissioning parents or the donors cannot directly approach the courts. They first have to approach the boards, which later take up the case at the judiciary. So, these are the key provisions of the ART bill, which has been designed by keeping in mind all the ethical and legal concerns surrounding assisted reproductive technology. Now, let's look at this article from page number 13. The European Union has announced the Global Gateway Initiative, through which it aims to make around 300 billion euros in investment in key infrastructure projects around the world. Experts have argued that this infrastructure initiative of the EU is designed to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. See, China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, or also known as the One Belt, One Road Initiative, has been executing key infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Through these economic and strategic projects, China has been gaining a lot of influence in key markets, especially in middle and low income countries. So, to counter the rise of Chinese influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, at the G7 summit, the Western countries took a decision to launch the Build Back Better initiative, or also known as the Build Back Better World or the B3W initiative. While this initiative of the G7 is primarily led by the US, the European Union has launched an initiative of its own known as the Global Gateway Initiative with a funding of 300 billion euros or $340 billion. The EU has stated that its Global Gateway Initiative doesn't specifically target China's BRI, but however, it has acknowledged that Global Gateway Initiative is going to mutually reinforce the Build Back Better World initiative of the G7. So this leads strategic experts to conclude that the Western countries, led by US and West European countries, are launching their own global infrastructure initiatives to counter China's BRI by using the platforms created by G7 and the EU. While China's BRI is accused of pushing small, middle, and low income countries into a debt crisis or into a debt burden, the US and European countries are looking to offer an alternative to these countries through their Build Back Better World initiative and the Global Gateway initiative. This infrastructure project of the EU is going to be funded by the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and these funds will be mobilized for projects that will be taken up between 2021 and 2027. Through this infrastructure fund, the EU is looking to help the creation of key infrastructure, that is primarily connectivity infrastructure, both land-based and sea-based, in order to extend its influence across Asia, Africa, and as well as across Europe and Latin America. Through the Global Gateway Initiative, the EU is looking to focus on digital connectivity, clean energy, transport, health, education, and research. So, in these focus areas, the EU is looking to help out the low and middle income countries to bridge the investment gap that has emerged in their countries for infrastructure creation, especially after the breakout of the pandemic. Next, according to this article on page number 8, a RTI query to the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has revealed that in India, 1,160 elephants have been killed in the last 1 decade due to human intervention. This table over here provides the list of human activities which has contributed to elephant deaths in the country, and it includes electrocution, train accidents, poaching, poisoning. This data, brought out by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, helps us understand the impact of man-animal conflict and how different types of human intervention is threatening the lives of Indian elephants. So kindly remember the causes of death and in the same order, because the data could be very useful for both prelims and as well as for mains. Then coming to the last article on page number 8, the IMD or the India Meteorological Department has introduced a new forecasting system based on color codes. See, the IMD, which is responsible for forecasting temperatures of a particular region, is also responsible for issuing out alerts with regard to possible heat waves and cold waves. Under the current forecasting system, the IMD was trying to provide a number-based temperature deviation seen in a region to indicate whether the temperature in the given region would be above normal or below normal. But since such a number-based system can be inaccurate and lead to wrong forecasting and wrong alerts, the IMD has decided to introduce a new forecasting system based on a color-coded model. So henceforth, instead of giving out the temperature deviation in numbers, it is going to provide only color codes to a region to indicate the temperature deviation and to show whether the temperatures are normal or above normal or below normal. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question. Tensions have flared in Eastern Europe and on the Belarus-Poland border, with thousands of asylum seekers attempting to enter EU territory. In this context, examine the complex geopolitical issues that underlie this manufactured refugee crisis. The second question. The use of disruption of proceedings as a parliamentary tactic by opposition MPs and their suspension represents a worrying trend for parliamentary democracy. Critically evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.